right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the International Spy Museum. I'm Peter Ernest, the Executive Director, and I'm delighted to see you all here this evening. I think you're in for a real treat. There really is a Valerie Plame. You know, we're so used to, those of us who are Washington people, to folks like Valerie who all of a sudden splash, and that's the right word, I think, into the news. And then we never see them. They're photographs. We see them going in and out of congressional hearings or trying to hide behind a newspaper, walking into someone. Valerie, it's absolutely a delight to welcome you here on a book tour and not to appear before a congressional hearing.
I feel the same way.
What?
Thank you.
You feel the same way? Okay, good. I should tell you, Valerie is on a book tour, and I believe you were in New York this morning.
Yes.
Philadelphia.
Yes.
And then Washington.
Correct.
Good.
Best for last.
We're delighted to see you. What I would like to do is start out and interview Valerie for a bit, ask her some questions about her past and about the book. But we certainly have left plenty of time for questions from the audience. So I'm looking forward to your input. We will be talking, Valerie Plame's latest book, of course, is Burned. Her closest thing, I guess, to a memoir or autobiography was Fair Game, which is very exciting reading. It's something of a cliffhanger. So, Valerie, I'd like to start off with what I think is a hard topic, and that is your role in the agency as an operations officer, because it would come up from time to time when I would talk to people, and they would say, well, you know, she really wasn't an operations officer, or really she was just here, you know, minding a desk. Now, everything I know about your past, you were an operations officer. You did operate in undercover. You did deal with assets. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
First of all, I'm delighted to be here this evening. I think it's such an appropriate place, the Spy Museum. This is one of the best museums in town. So thank you for having me. Really appreciative. Yes. So when my true CIA affiliation was leaked by senior members of the Bush administration in 2003, part of that whole narrative was, oh, well, she's not really covert. And that narrative held sway for a long time because those in position of power had the loudest voices. And it also sought, became a partisan issue very quickly with, as we know, going into the war with Iraq and so forth. And it was a really, frankly, a very dark period for my husband and I, because immediately we were plunged into this media maelstrom, and we were called liars and traitors. I was called, a member of Congress called me a glorified secretary. And the word was put out by those that were offended that my husband had the audacity to say, you know, maybe the invasion of Iraq was not the best idea we ever had. You know, what they were putting out was, you know, she was never covert. Anyway, everyone knew she worked at the CIA, and that was utter and complete nonsense. But you don't have to take my word for it. During the trial of the former chief of staff for the Vice President Cheney, during the trial of Scooter Libby, both the judge, the prosecutor, and various witnesses attested to the fact that I was indeed covert until I was not.
Okay, that's true of all of us. By the way, I'm not going to share with you what the public refers to members of Congress as, so we'll just leave it with your statement as to what he said.
Root canals are more popular than Congress right now.
Okay. Could you just discuss some aspects of your operational career, one of which I find people often misunderstand is cover, is living undercover. operating undercover, using another name, because I find that when we talk about it, when people like myself talk about it, it sounds rather glib. Oh yes, we're undercover, as if that's, oh yes, you just do that. Could you just talk about, I realize you may have to sanitize it a bit, but to the extent that you can.
Sure. How I think it is best understood and how I choose to describe it is that cover is really on a spectrum. And at one end, you have deep cover, and that is where you have no official affiliation with the United States government. And that's perhaps where you have some corporate connection, you're a storm door salesman, or something like that. There are certain occupations that the CIA is forbidden to be associated with, the clergy, journalism, NGOs, and so forth, which is why there was a big dust-up, and I don't know all the details of it, but we do know the story of, during the search for Osama bin Laden, one of the Pakistani assets that helped us, he was a doctor, and it was under the guise of an inoculation program and so forth. I found that obviously had to get approvals at the very highest levels, because that's highly unusual, if indeed that is the case. And then on the other end, you have official cover. Typically, although not always, it's under State Department cover, but there's other possibilities. And there's sort of gradations in between. And you can imagine in this day and age where, if you Google an old boyfriend or an old girlfriend, click, 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 it doesn't take much to find out where they went to school and, are they anywhere, do they have any social media presence online and so forth. So that applies to cover positions as well. It's actually much harder for the CIA and their cover in today's world where so much of us is online, and so that's where it is. Now, what you had asked me initially about my cover, over the course of my career, I had different variations of all of them. And I was an operations officer, which means you spot, assess, develop, and recruit foreign nationals to provide intelligence to senior U.S. policymakers. I developed my expertise in nuclear counterproliferation, which I loved my job, very proud to serve my country. And in the run-up to the war with Iraq, what my specific job was, I was head of the ops task force at one point, and what we were doing was looking at the alleged Iraqi WMD program. Who were the scientists? Who were the key scientists? How were they procuring their material? What was their network? What was the state of their R&D? Because our intelligence on Iraq was extraordinarily thin, I think it's fair to say, due to a couple reasons. One was that, of course, we had closed our embassy after the first Gulf War, and then you may recall in 1998, Saddam Hussein kicked out the UN weapons inspectors. So right after 9/11, as we know now, that the smoke was literally coming off the towers, that then Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld was opening up maps on the conference table at Camp David and saying, well, there's not much in Afghanistan, but Iraq, now there we can do something. So that's when they realized the focus was on Iraq, and this agency was well behind the 8 ball.
Yeah. It was interesting to hear you say that you loved that work. What do you miss?
You feel you're getting a government salary, so those of you in the room know that that doesn't go very far. So you don't do it for that. You're doing it because it's something worthwhile. I come from a family that public service was considered to be something noble. My father served, he was an Air Force officer, served in the South Pacific during World War II. My brother was in Vietnam. He was wounded as a Marine. So when I was given this opportunity to join the CIA, I jumped at it. It seemed like it was pretty interesting. And I loved what I was doing, even though there's lots of boring waiting time. There's lots of bureaucracy. There's all of that. But I would tell you, if you recall, after Osama bin Laden was killed, and the public heard about sort of the bags of hard drives and disk drives that they pulled out of his safe house and brought back to headquarters. You know, I really wanted to be in that room when they were opening up those bags and look at what do they have.
Yeah. I don't think they've publicized yet the full take from the Osama bin Laden raid.
No,
have they?
I have not seen anything. I assume it was used, of course, for leads and piecing together the rest of the network. But sort of, I have to say, now in these days where ISIS is such a looming threat, Al-Qaeda seems, you know, so yesterday, right?
Valerie, you went into the agency at a particular time, and I think it reflected certainly in your memoir. There is some reference to being a woman, to being a female operations officer, and I wonder if you would be kind enough to comment on that, and to the extent that you have any feel for whatever your impression was, and whether you feel it has persisted or is still the same.
Well, the CIA, as many of you may know, really did start out as the old boys club. It was Ivy League, East Coast, male, white Anglo-Saxons, the tap on the shoulder and so forth. And that sentiment prevailed for quite some time. The women that did go into operations were typically in support roles, secretaries, maybe they ran a safe house or something, but by dint of perseverance and in intellect, if they wanted to do something else, they continued and tried to get into a field operations position. But it came at a great personal cost. It really did. But like anywhere in corporate America, you know, it's gotten better. I think the number 2 in the director of operations is a woman now, or at least it was last year. I think the DI, head of the DI, Director of Intelligence, is a woman. And so the agency proudly trots that out and say, see, you know, everything's great. But it's not yet. There's still a ways to go. It is a man's world. But I think I was successful in my career because I went after areas where I didn't bang my head against the wall. You know, I'm never going to be able to infiltrate Hezbollah cell, right? You know, it's like, who's that blonde chick in the corner? Is it Dari's cousin? What? But I could go after, for instance, talk to businessmen who wanted to sell nuclear widgets to all the wrong kinds of people. And so that is how I navigated it. I was fortunate. I had very good female friends, classmates that had really old school COSs that really thought women should not be in the field. Just this side of you really should be barefoot and pregnant and in the kitchen. And that would have been really hard to have that kind of boss because, hello, it's a big wide world out there. You need all kinds of people to go after all kinds of targets. I think it's obvious, but of course there's systemic issues that need to be addressed.
Yeah. You mentioned that you used the term serving as a woman, and you referred to it as at great cost. What about having a family? Does that certainly adds to the burden, whether it's for both the husband and the spouse, but as a female operations officer
Sure.
with a family?
Absolutely. I was fortunate in that I have to be careful how I say this because the agency has made it clear that I am not permitted to acknowledge any agency affiliation prior to 2002. So I just fell from the sky. But when I fell from the sky, I had some time with the agency. I married late. I had children late. So I had for me personally, a lot of career. And then I had twins in 2000. Fortunately, my parents lived not too far away, so they were able to help when my children were babies and I would have to leave. But let's face it, for anyone who's a parent in the audience, you know how profoundly your life view changes with children. And in 2003, with the Iraq War, we were sending intelligence, we were asking for volunteers to go to Iraq and work, and Afghanistan prior to that actually, and asking for volunteers to go. And I really wanted to go, but I also had to say, wait a minute, I have a responsibility to very young children, and I don't know, there are still combat operations going on, so you have to weigh that. It's tough. I mean, I think the agency divorce rate is astronomical. I think the alcoholism rate is pretty high because of the pressures of the job on the family. There's built-in secrecy, which is not so terrific for a relationship. But I was fortunate. My husband was career Foreign Service, so he, of course, had worked with agency folks all throughout his career, so he had a better idea of what was expected.
You mentioned these things like alcoholism and so forth. Are you associating that with the agency and the nature of the work, or today's situation with the high stress in dealing with terrorists and situations like Coast, where we lost a couple of women in the bombing?
Terrible, and I knew them.
Yes.
I knew them both.
Yes.
Which, by the way, I would highly recommend that book. I think it was called Triple Agent.
Yes.
By Jody or Joby Warwick. Mm-hmm. I thought it was very well done about how that happened, that terrible, tragic accident in Kandahar, or was it Coast, in December 2000.
In Coast,
it was
when
Coast.
we lost
Yeah. So what was the question again? I just was remembering the book.
No, I was wondering, you mentioned certain, as the result of stress, alcoholism,
right,
and so forth
right.
and so on.
Okay,
I was wondering if you were associating that with the nature of agency work, the high stress and so forth,
I think
or today's agency.
There have been drinkers in the agency from day one, serious drinkers. And, because, yes, there is added stress today because of where we are in the world, and the CIA, I think, is much more paramilitary since 9/11, for all the reasons we can understand. But I think that has been a present thread throughout the history, alas.
Let me just ask you, does Vanessa, who is your protagonist, your character in the book Burned, and in your series that you have started, is Vanessa Valerie Plame? Because there are certain things that she manifests that I'm hearing as you speak.
Well, definitely, Vanessa is informed by my experiences. She's smarter than I am, way better at foreign languages than I'll ever be. I wanted very much, the genesis of this whole series was to depict a female CIA ops officer in a much more realistic way, because my personal irritation is how the girls are always portrayed in popular culture very much as a caricature, really, or a highly sexualized. I'm here to tell you that you do not collect intelligence when there's a gun in the room, okay? It's, and so I wanted, I hadn't thought about writing fiction at all. My publisher, who did Fair Game, approached me and said, well, what do you think about doing this? And I had only written pretty dry intelligence reports and the memoir up to that point. But I thought, okay, well, if I'm going to do this, I want it, of course, to be entertaining. You have to get people to buy your book and hopefully enjoy it, but also a much more realistic depiction of a female ops officer.
Let me just give a few bio details that I didn't at the beginning, and I should. Then I have one question, and I'd like to open it up. I think many of you are familiar with Valerie Plame's background. It was highly publicized. She was, in fact, a covert operations officer and worked for most of your career on non-proliferation issues, trying to ferret out intelligence on the proliferation of weaponry. She is now an active member of the Global Zero Leadership Board, which is trying to either control or bring down to zero the nuclear weapons. Maybe you could add to what I'm saying?
I'm happy to. Global Zero is actually based here in Washington, but it is international and nonpartisan in its scope. Its ultimate objective is the elimination of nuclear weapons. It can't be done unilaterally, and no one's suggesting that. But it is, I think, abundantly clear that we've only just gotten lucky so far. The possibilities of miscalculation or mistake and a detonation of some sort of nuclear weapon would simply be catastrophic, even a dirty bomb. Catastrophic. Another book I would recommend to you, I just read a few months ago, it came out I think last year by Eric Schlosser, called Command and Control. Have you read that?
No.
So good. It's a story of a Titan II missile silo in Arkansas in 1980, nuclear tipped, and a maintenance guy is down there doing routine maintenance, and somehow his wrench kind of falls down the 40-foot silo, and weirdly, 1 in a million chance, sort of pierces the skin. And the next thing you know, you have a nuclear tipped missile that's ready to explode. What are you going to do? But it's not just that story. I mean, he weaves the whole story of near misses, near accidents, and it's a compelling narrative. I highly recommend it. So Global Zero, a couple years ago, they were one of the producers of a documentary called Countdown to Zero, which I appeared in as well. And they had the lineup of people talking about this issue, the dangers of nuclear proliferation, was astonishing. Everyone from Mikhail Gorbachev to Tony Blair, Queen Noor was involved, Jimmy Carter, Jimmy Baker, Kissinger. These are all, in some cases, literally men who had their finger on the button, and how close we've come. So what I like most, I think, about Global Zero is that it doesn't leave the important issue, critical issue, I mean, truly, it's existential, to a small group of older men. Not that there's anything the matter with older men, but it tries to broaden the base of people who care about this. This used to be a huge issue at the height of the Cold War. The biggest congregation protest anywhere ever was in Central Park in the mid-'80s on this issue. And after the Cold War, everyone just kind of went, oh, well, we don't have to worry about that anymore. But the truth is the threat is even larger today because of the rise of terrorism, the spread of nuclear technology. We have been bombarded after a terrible summer worth of terrible news on Ebola and ISIS and jet planes falling out of the sky. But I'm telling you, the nuclear weapons one, and that's what Global Zero does, is top of the list.
Let me just add a couple of things that you are also. You are a consultant to Warner Brothers TV. You're on the boards of United Way of Santa Fe County, Postpartum Support International, and very much involved in local public school reform in Santa Fe. A graduate of Pennsylvania State University, the London School of Economics, and the College of Europe in Bruges, Belgium, and she has written for Newsweek, CNN, The Daily Beast, The Huffington Post, The Guardian, and others. One last question, then I'd like to open it up. There are a number of young folks here this evening, Valerie, and we often attract people who are either studying or interested in intelligence as a career. What might your advice be, both as intelligence as a career and CIA as an agency?
So both my husband and I do speak a lot to university students, which I always enjoy, but I never lose my opportunity to talk to the young people that come to me afterward, or encourage them to consider public service as a career. Obviously, the challenges facing our country are enormous, and we really need the best and the brightest. It doesn't have to be the CIA, and despite everything that happened to me, I still encourage people to go into it. We can have a whole other conversation about how the intelligence community is, I think, incredibly bloated and not terribly effective right now. That's something else. But nevertheless, it gives you an amazing career where you feel that once in a while you really do something worthwhile.
Okay, Valerie, let's see if other folks have questions besides just me. Here's one right here. If you would be kind enough to wait for the microphone, everybody can hear the question. Thank you.
What did you think of the movie Fair Game and Naomi Watts' portrayal of you?
Well, I will tell you, Fair Game, I thought, was a pretty accurate depiction of what happened, the essential truth. Obviously, it's a movie, so it gets condensed, and there are some composite characters. I cannot speak to what I thought of Naomi. Is a lovely person, and she's a very good actress. My husband thought she did a good job, but I live in me, so you can't. I thought that Sean Penn did a great job as my husband. They share a certain intensity, shall we say.
And how does Joe react to that, knowing that Payne did a good job as him?
There's quite a little bromance going on there.
There's a little bromance, okay.
Totally.
All right,
Totally.
okay. All right, there's another question right there, Amanda, near you.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. Loved Fair Game, both the book and the movie. So I have a question for, if you could speak to the agency, both the analysts and the case officers, what would you hope that your legacy be?
I don't want to speak about my legacy because I think one of the misperceptions that's out there in the popular culture is that it's very much a lone wolf game, and it's not. I tried to show that in Burned and in Blowback. It is truly a team effort. I, as a case officer, might be the one sitting down with the terrorist and trying to convince him to, provide intelligence. But that is after deep consultations with analysts. I make sure that the security team is in place. If there's surveillance that's necessary, if there's any sort of technical thing. It's a huge team effort. Anyone who tries to go it alone is not going to be successful. I think this has been some rough sailing for, the list is long of where the agency is today and how they're perceived publicly. Unfortunately, I think it has just gotten so big now, not just the agency, but what I call the military-industrial intelligence complex, enormous, and there is, I read all the time of senior U.S., very, very senior U.S. policymakers that say, I can't take it all in. Finally our little brains are just little pea brains. You can't take it all in. They get the threat matrix every morning, they get their briefings. It is too much, and when you can't prioritize, it's very difficult to strategize. Where do you put your efforts? So after 9/11, after the 9/11 commission, there was what I think was a knee-jerk reaction. So, there was a terrible intelligence failure. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And one of the things they did was put this over bureaucratic layer of the Directorate of National Intelligence, headed by James Clapper right now, on top of it all, on top of 16 or 17 intelligence agencies?
Yes.
It is, talk about repetition of effort and the revolving door and the high number of contractors that are doing what I consider to be, in some cases, core intelligence work. I find it astonishing and dismaying, and I don't think that we are any safer. And not to mention, we're not getting much bang for a buck as taxpayers.
All right, other questions? One right here on the aisle, Amanda.
So I have a two-part question. The first is, what is your opinion of Edward Snowden? And the second one is, do you think there's adequate oversight today of the intelligence community?
Both good questions. So
And you're answering them, not me.
yeah, just looking for time. With Snowden, I don't like to go down that rabbit hole. I get asked a lot, is he a traitor or a whistleblower? My experience, in which I have some, when you focus on the person rather than the issue, there's a problem. The issue is privacy versus security in a healthy democracy. What does that balance look like? I mean, Ed Snowden really is just the shiny ball that the media is chasing. And the truth is, I don't think we know all the information that we really need to make that assessment yet. We have what Ed Snowden says, we have what the NSA says, but we don't really know. Did he really try to go to his supervisors and say, I'm very concerned about this? Or we don't know all of that yet. But in any case, that really is irrelevant, because here's my question to you all. Would you rather not know what we know now, what the NSA is doing in our names? I think U.S. history is a long one of pendulum swinging too far to one side or the other. So that plays right into the second question of oversight, of which I think has been sorely lacking. There is no congressional backbone. Although recently, Dianne Feinstein, of course, got up on her hind legs, really upset when she found out the Senate computers had been hacked. I think that's not the right word, but that the CIA had been looking at the Senate staffers' emails and their review in this so-called torture report, which still has not been released, right?
No, not yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
December, I think.
is that when they're saying?
December, yeah.
So oversight, I'm a big believer in a strong intelligence community and a service, but it has to come with adequate oversight, adequate elected official oversight.
Which I think went to your second question, right? Just to draw this out for a moment, when there are arguments pro and con about the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI, General Clapper. And one of the things that Mike Hayden said when he was at CIA and no longer had to be the DCI was that by not having to do that, it totally freed him to run the agency, because that is the primary human agency in the intelligence community. So he was totally freed from having to do the briefings of the president and pull all the analysis together. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I don't know exactly what that wiring diagram looks like, but I know there's, I don't know, the DNI, it's estimated at what, 1,500, 2,000 people?
Yes, more than we anticipated.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, there is a certain amount of bureaucracy, self-aggrandizement. That is just how it happens. I have to tell you, every time, I don't live in Washington anymore. We moved from here in 2007, and every time I come back several times a year, and I'm astonished at the growth. This is a boom town, folks, in case who can find a place to park? Who can get a restaurant reservation? It is booming. And where do you think that money is coming from? It is almost all contractors, Homeland Security, that whole thing that happened after 9/11. Another book, I should be recommending my book, but here's another book you need to read.
I'll hold it up.
Besides Burned, you want to read Dana Priest's Top Secret America. Came out 2 years ago. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with The Post. I think she's still with The Post. Talking about the incredible growth of the national security state from 9/11.
She has presented here at the
has
museum
she?
on her
She's
book.
terrific.
Yes, yeah,
Love her.
she is excellent. Just out of interest, you truly are from the hinterland. So what is the perception, for example, of the whole intelligence thing, CIA, all renditions, tortures, reports, and so forth, in Santa Fe?
Well, yeah, it's, Washington has that same centric view of itself as that famous New Yorker cover.
Yes.
Where it's, the world is Manhattan and then, New Jersey is really far away. But I would say, really, outside of Washington, and I'm sure in Washington too, obviously, there is a deep sense that it's just not working. Everything from the IRS to the CDC, the gridlock in Congress, they throw it all in together. People, they don't, believe me, they don't distinguish between the CIA and the State Department's, intelligence
Sure.
thing. It's all just one big mess. It's not working in Washington.
Yeah. Well, they did catch the last White House fence jumper, so there's something to be said for that.
No. The dog caught.
The dog, yes.
The
But
dog
but they
caught
let the dog go. Yeah. Okay. Other questions from you all there in the back there?
Hi, I just would like to thank you and your husband for the tremendous courage you showed in coming forward and exposing the Iraqi story on nuclear thing. Just like to ask you, do you think the experience of the Ukraine is going to keep other nations from giving up their nuclear weapons and encourage other nations that don't have them now to want to get them?
You're talking about the Russian aggression?
Yeah, I'm talking about
yeah.
the fact that Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons with our guarantee of their borders.
That's a very complex question and a good one. Let me start first tangentially, but and I'm totally biased because my background, of course, is human intelligence. But we get so excited and carried away by technology, which does wonderful things. Who doesn't have an iPad or a smartphone? And those billion-dollar satellites are really terrific. But I bet President Obama would have paid a pretty penny if he had one really good human source inside Putin's circle when the Russian tanks were on the border with the Ukraine, right? Because all the satellite imagery in the world is going to show you that they're lined up, but unless you have that human intelligence to tell you what their intent is, you're a little blind. In regards to the nuclear aspect of it, what I would say is this: and this is part of what Global Zero and others are trying very hard to do, that nuclear weapons do not make us safer. To the contrary, they really are last century's weapons. Look at what's happened in Syria, in Ebola, with Ebola and so forth. Nuclear weapons, having that does not make us safer. Where you have, and what you need to have is a highly orchestrated and very careful way to step down the nuclear weapons of all the at least 9 declared nuclear states in the world, so that even terrorists cannot get a hold of dirty bomb material. And there is, of course, a tendency in the third world, as we have seen in Pakistan and others, that if you have a nuclear weapon, all of a sudden you're in the big boys club. But that has to be, the whole mentality has to be changed to where the political leadership understands that it doesn't make them safer. To the contrary.
By the way, the music you may be hearing occasionally, including the drums, is not from within the museum. It's a small brass band out on the sidewalk, and their rendition of When the Saints Go Marching In is perfectly dreadful. So I hope they don't do that. Other questions? Yes, from you. There's one right there.
Yes. Could you comment on the post 9/11 direction of the agency toward its sort of a militarization trend as opposed to its original mission of intelligence gathering?
Yeah, it's not the first time, for sure. During the Vietnam era, there were quite a few military officers that did their tour in Vietnam and then were pulled into the agency. And there was a certain paramilitary aspect to the agency, and certainly out of its origins, out of World War II and the OSS days. Certainly since 9/11, 2 wars, where you train case officers. I mean, I had my share of training with a variety of weapons and so forth, but that has been stepped up incredibly, because if you're going to send a case officer into a dodgy area, into Afghanistan or Iraq or so many other places that are volatile, they really do need to understand how to carry a weapon. But that comes at a cost, not least of which, think about how, and I know this happened for years, our case officers in Iraq had to go out to a clandestine meeting in armed vehicles. You know, they had to get out of the green zone. It was hardly clandestine, that's for sure. And when you are unable to interact with the population in a meaningful way, you lose valuable intelligence. I read earlier this year, The Good Spy, was that right? By Robert, about Robert Ames?
By Kai Bird, yes.
By
yeah,
Kai Bird, yeah, A Good Spy. And he was, in a way, although much better, like Lawrence of Arabia. You know, he spoke the language. He really knew the people. There was a moment in time where he was getting incredible intelligence from, at that time, what was the radicalized PLO, you know, around the Munich time and so forth, getting it to the President of the United States, you know, moving closer to maybe some sort of resolution of the issues in that part of the world. His life was cut short. He was killed in the Beirut bombing. But that's, you know, that's how you really have to collect intelligence, not in an armed car.
So the question that I'm often asked is, given that so much of the agency's involvement in recent years has been supporting the warfighter, and we've been in Afghanistan and Iraq and these other countries, has the cadre, the operational cadre, lost some of the old human touch of long-range recruiting, cultivation, and so forth of human sources? Because this is all well and good to go out in a Humvee to meet people, but people, the young officers, therefore, are not learning. They're not getting mentored. They're not learning.
I'm obviously not there now, but I have to believe that's true, because the agency wants to be so responsive to what the White House is looking for, the National Security Council, and right now it's all about Syria and what's going on in Iraq, Afghanistan. And it's clear that we have very little human intelligence in Syria among the various rebel groups and so forth. We spoke just before this about ISIS and how quickly they have advanced. I've been asked several times, was that an intelligence failure? And let me tell you, as a former intelligence officer, it's really painful to admit that might be. I don't know. We don't know what the White House was briefed on by those in the intelligence community about ISIS. You know, were they hopping up and down for the last year going, you really need to pay attention to this? We don't know. But what we do know is that they are rapidly gaining territory, and this is a force to be reckoned with. And I think the administration is dealing, like I think every American really, with ambivalence. I mean, really, we've just gotten out of 2 wars. It's been a slog, and we've lost so many, not to mention so many civilians in those countries that have been misplaced or killed. How it's not just an easy question. Who do we arm in Syria? They absolutely, in Syria and Iraq, they absolutely have to step up. But the question is, who? To whom do we give the weapons? And as we've seen, it can turn on us. Apparently, ISIS has armed itself with a lot of, that's right, U.S.-supplied weaponry. And this is just my own personal question, what I want to know is how come after billions of dollars and years of U.S. military training of the Iraqi forces, that at the first dust-up, they ripped off their uniforms and fled over the nearest hill. I find, as a taxpayer, I want to know. I really want to know what happened. Our military is the best in the world, but something went seriously awry. So there's no answer to that. That's just my question.
Okay. Well, you're entitled to have some. I mean, we have some, and you have some. How are we doing? Questions out here? There's one right there. Did you have one here? No. Oh, you're scratching. Okay.
Don't do that in an auction.
Valerie, I'm going to take you back to your book. That's why you're here, remember? So this week we've had got to see a little bit about how Leon Panetta released his book this week, and how he was able to get his book cleared through the CIA censors by basically playing really hardball with them. So maybe you could speak a little bit about how your experience in getting fair game through the whole redaction process, and how much of the book was excised out. And then did you have to clear your fiction?
So that's a lot of questions. First, with Panetta, I don't know him personally, but I have very good friends that are very close to him and think of him so highly, with such respect. But I have to say, just in general, I find it distasteful when senior government officials leave and the door is still swinging, and they have a memoir that comes out that sort of trashes everyone they've just worked with. I know Panetta maybe didn't do all of that, but we've seen a string of this. I just find it like, ugh, I don't know. I just find it distasteful. That would be on any side, not just this administration. And I don't know what I heard, and I'm not sure of this, that Panetta was given a lot of pushback from the PRB, Publication Review Board, which is the CIA, and I think he just went ahead and said, the heck with it, I'm going to publish anyway. Is that correct? That he, more or less? So what happened with Fair Game was really traumatic for me, because, as I said, I was so proud to work for the agency, and when I decided to write this memoir, I never anticipated that I would have to sue the agency, but that's what I did. They, as I mentioned, they have made it clear that I am not permitted to acknowledge publicly any agency affiliation prior to 2002. As you might imagine, thus making a memoir somewhat difficult. And underneath the redactions is nothing that has to do, that would ever jeopardize national security. It's not sources and methods. It was clearly punitive, I believe, and this is my opinion, purely punitive in nature. And so it was really painful to go through that whole process. When I got the manuscript back from them, there were pages and pages and pages of nothing but black redactions. And we sued them. And because the judiciary in this day that we are living in is extremely deferential to anything that says national security, they go, oh, okay, national security is somehow infringed upon. And I think that comes at a cost. But yes, of course, I signed a secrecy agreement. I always have to put anything that I write through the Publication Review Board. I did it, of course, with Blowback. I did it with Burned. It was, I think they got that these were, fiction. I have not revealed sources or methods, although I tried to be as realistic as possible. The PRB tends to be, in my view, somewhat arbitrary in how it does this. You may know something about that yourself. And by that, I mean, if I may give an example, hopefully there's no one here from the PRB, but they redacted the words, I'll just say the words, station chief, okay? I couldn't, this was in Fair Game, I couldn't use those words. Station chief is the CIA boss overseas. Well, they also allowed, not long after that, a book to come out by a former case officer entitled Station Chief. Okay? So, I mean, it's no doubt a very difficult job, but I'm glad that they realize that these are works of fiction.
Well, since you are doing fiction, of course, you could have a terrorist attack directed against the Publications Review Board at the CIA.
I want more books published. I don't see it.
Okay.
I don't see it happening.
You and I both. I might mention there have been some very. You ask about women in the agency. There have been some very strong women who have served in the agency and come out and spoken publicly about their experiences. one of whom is Valerie Plame, who's with us this evening. Another one is Melissa Maley, who just raised that last question. So any of you young women interested in speaking to someone who's been there, done that, there's two at least fine exemplars here. Let me just mention one thing. In Valerie's book, Fair Game, she has had to skirt the issue of what she did. It sounds like she joined the agency and 2 days later quit. And that was because, at the direction of the Publications Review Board. What the publisher did in this instance was have a journalist, a woman by the name of Laura Rosen, reconstruct Valerie's career. So you have an afterword in this book, which essentially tells you what Valerie's career path
Right, she is not
was.
beholden to the secrecy agreement.
That's
So
right.
She's just doing her job.
Yeah, so there are various ways of dealing with this issue. Other questions from the audience? Had some very good questions. Yes, sir, that's Vince Houghton, our historian.
So I'd like to ask a nuclear intelligence dissemination question because I'm a dork. So I want to know about how difficult you, and certainly your husband in this case, found it to convince policymakers who have very little or no scientific background of nuclear intelligence. And I'm asking that because you do see that again today with the questions about Syrian chemical weapons or Ebola or climate change or other issues where your intelligence can be fantastic, but if you can't convince policymakers that it matters, then nothing gets done. Is that, as a nuclear intelligence officer yourself, is that something you ran into again and again?
Well, look, I am not a scientist. I was a liberal arts major in college, but it didn't take me long to recognize the catastrophic horrors that nuclear weapons can unleash. And you have to believe that it holds true for senior officials as well. We do know that President Obama, I think he wrote his graduate thesis on nuclear proliferation. I mean, he has a personal, passionate feeling about it. And in fact, you might remember he went to Prague in April of about 3 years ago and said, this is something we must work toward. It was huge. It was very high up on his agenda. But as we know, with Obama, he probably wakes up every morning and goes, oh, I can't believe I'm still the president. Because it's, things just kept piling on, right? And you have to deal with a crisis of the moment, which is what I talked about a little earlier of overwhelming your priorities, your strategy. I would love for everyone in Congress and everyone in the executive branch to have a copy of Countdown to Zero so that they are, you need a drink after you see that, believe me, because it really drives home how close we've come. I think honestly, the other huge threat that we face is climate change. And again, that's something where philosophically, congenitally, I don't know, but there are those that deny that it's happening. And that's just not a healthy way to conduct a debate about problems that affect not just us, but globally.
Is that not now considered a national security issue, the climate change issue?
It is, but it seems to be sort of, the poor man's priority, right? It's like it feels like they're doing it because they feel they should. And I know there are people that are working on it very seriously, but when you have elected members of Congress who are completely opposed to any notion that this is something that is a problem, it's hard making headway, huh?
Yeah. I get the sense that as you and Joe sit at the breakfast table in Santa Fe, about every other week you get totally outraged by some news from Washington. So, is that right?
I don't as much as Joe.
Okay.
He throws stuff, yells at the TV, and so forth. It's very helpful that we are far away in New Mexico, but we follow things very closely. At the same time, for the first time in our adult lives, we actually live in one place longer than 2 years. And this has been huge for us. And we've become deeply engaged in our community, in our state, in the politics that matter there. We never had that before. So But yeah, Joe still gets pretty exercised, yeah.
You have to remind him that the TV is not an interactive medium. Other questions? Okay, there have been some very, very good ones. Here's one right up front, Laura.
And then we've got one right behind that.
And one behind, okay?
So can we talk about Scooter Libby for just a moment? So I assume that you're not exchanging holiday cards with him, and you have children, and it was a very painful, difficult time for you and your family. Just curious, your children are going to read and hear, and what would you say to them about why this individual did this to you?
Well, they've unfortunately have grown up with this. This started when they were 3 years old, and I remember having to explain what a trial and a jury is to a 6-year-old. That's kind of hard. But at each age, they've become more cognizant, of course, more cognizant of it all. They're 14 and a half now, so of course they're deeply unimpressed by their parents, anything that they do. Except once I met like the uncle of someone that was in the Hunger Games. Then I was big, and I got a picture. Yeah, it was great. But no, seriously, we do. Who knows what my children will do? But you hope that they understand the importance of public service and the importance of a citizen's responsibilities, not just our rights, and standing up, holding your government to account for their words and deeds. And we don't spend any time being bitter because it's just so useless. We live in a country of laws, and it went through the judicial system, and it is what it is. And I'm looking forward. I'm doing 100 things now. Those that were involved will have to work it out with their own conscience.
Excellent.
You mentioned being involved in community activities and state activities. That is one of the things that people in the diplomatic service, the foreign service, CIA, and so forth, usually deny themselves because they just simply cannot, they can't get involved in all those things, for cover reasons or time, or because they're often working at night. A quick question, you're an author. When do you write?
I find that my brain doesn't work creatively after lunch, so it has to be before. When we started Burned, my co-author and I, Sarah Lovett, we went for a great hike around Santa Fe. She happens to live in Santa Fe. That really is just by happenstance. So we hiked this really steep mountain, and we could barely talk much. But by the top, it was about a 4-hour hike to the top and to the bottom, and by the end of that hike, we had sort of blocked out Act 1, 2, and 3. You have to be disciplined. I'm fortunate that Sarah really understands the craft of writing and pacing and so forth. But what I don't miss, I'll tell you this, what I don't miss about my government service is that it doesn't matter how senior you are, you still have to tell your boss that that you have to go for a dentist appointment or whatever. I mean, that's just how it works. And now I'm doing so many different things. I've never worked harder, but my time is my own. And I do a lot of sideline sitting by volleyball and soccer games.
So you can go to as many dental appointments as you want to.
Without telling anyone.
Okay. All right. Yes, Laura, go ahead.
Hi, Ms. Plame. I would like to hear your perspective or your thoughts on Ishmael Jones' book, The Human Factor, and his perspective, I guess, on the agency.
Yeah, I read that. It's been a few years. What I recall is that I thought he got some things absolutely right, but obviously his experience was rather negative. I mean, he had a really bad taste in his mouth, and he just kind of came away thinking everyone was really incompetent and stupid. I have ideas who that might be. I'm not 100% sure. I don't. But the agency is enormous, and everyone's experience is going to be different. I'm trying to think of some others that I've read. That Charles Faddis wrote one as well. I knew him. Others that, I read them all, and I find that there's bits and pieces in all that ring true, and others that I simply did not see. Hank Crumpton, have you had him here?
Yes.
Yeah, so Hank, I don't forget the name of his book. Sorry, Hank. But an outstanding officer, but his chapter on recruitment I thought was the best I've ever read, on what it feels like, how you get there. It was, I thought, very visceral in that. I thought it was the best there.
Okay, there may be copies back there, I'm not sure.
I forget the name of his
You
book.
are staying for signing, are you,
Yes, of
afterwards?
course, yes.
Wonderful. Let me just see if we have other questions. Amanda, on your side, how about here? Laura?
No.
Valerie, it's been an absolute delight having you here. And
Thank you
so
for
thank
having
you
me.
so much for including
Thank you for
us
having
in
me.
your
Thank
tour.
you.
Okay. All right. Good. Okay. So we'll take you to the back. In fact, Amanda's going to take you to the back. Okay. All right. Thank you all so much for coming, and have a great rest of your evening.